morning, everyone. Let's try that again. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. There we go. Well, welcome. This is a real treat for me personally. 21 years ago this week, although it had been about 5 months in the planning, I got to work directly with our guest today at an international meeting whose complexity none of us could have imagined, and none of us could have imagined and understood how much a part of the vernacular the city we were visiting would become, and that city is Kyoto. Our guest today was the principal negotiator for the United States, acting as the Undersecretary of State for International Economic Affairs, was the principal negotiator on the Kyoto climate negotiations, and I was the deputy of the White House team. But this is one of these complex negotiations where the State Department is in charge, and at the White House you realize that you're just following the lead of the best person you could find. Think about this challenge. You have, in the United States, climate and energy is about 1/6 of the US economy, about the same size as healthcare. So you're negotiating internationally with 192 other countries for whom that is also the case. And if you think about how complex the politics are on healthcare, on climate change, they're probably more complex. And you're doing that with a Rubik's Cube with 192 other squares. And the US government trusted one person to do that 21 years ago, and that's our guest today. Stu has served in 3 presidential administrations. He was the chief White House domestic policy advisor to President Carter, and that's the topic of today's conversation since he's just written a magisterial book on it. He was also the US ambassador to the European Union in the Clinton administration, Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade in Clinton, and Undersecretary of State in Economic, Business, and Cultural Affairs for President Clinton, and then also Deputy Secretary of the Treasury for President Obama. He's taken on key other international initiatives, the transatlantic agenda with the European Union, which was a major economic undertaking, the transatlantic business dialogue. He's worked on the Japan port agreements, the Kyoto Protocol on global warming, where he led the US delegation, and was special representative for President Clinton and Secretary of State on the Holocaust era related issues. He's received 8 honorary doctorates and high civilian awards, including the Legion of Honor in France and other civilian awards in Germany, Austria, Belgium. He's worked with the most important people who have run the federal government over the last 40 years. If you just think about this, it was 21 years ago that we were in Kyoto, and Stu had first gone to work for a president 20 years before that, and he still looks about the same as he did 40 years ago. He's written articles in the New York Times, Financial Times, International Herald Tribune, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs. He currently heads Covington's international practice, focusing on trade and other international business transactions. He grew up in the public schools of Atlanta. You can still hear that soft Southern accent. Phi Beta Kappa and cum laude graduate of our neighbor to the south, UNC, and of Harvard Law School. I'm sorry? And he's married to Frances Eizenstat with 2 sons and 8 grandchildren. And before I introduce Russell, I just want to give Stu a big round of applause because it's just such a personal thing. And Stu's going to be interviewed today by Russell Riley, who is a professional interviewer, not usually in front of 100 and something people plus a live stream. Russell is the co-director of our oral history project, which has done, as I think you know, the official oral history for every president going back to Jimmy Carter. And these oral histories are an invaluable resource to historians around the world, including the historian that's with us today. And so it's a double delight that Russell gets to interview Stu, because Stu was interviewed for the Carter Oral History Project now some 25 or 30 years ago when we did that project. He is the White Burkett Miller Center Professor of Ethics and Institutions and is one of the foremost authorities in the country on elite oral history, as well as the leading presidential oral historian in the country. He's logged more than 1,500 hours of confidential interviews with senior members of White Houses from going back to the Carter administration. He's led both the Clinton Oral History Project and the George W. Bush Oral History Project, and he lectures extensively on American politics and historical methods in the United States and around the world. He's a graduate of Auburn University and received the Charles Anson Award as the outstanding student in economics there. He studied at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government before coming back here and receiving his PhD here in politics. He's taught at Penn and at Georgetown, and he's also been the program director for the Salzburg Seminar, which is a very important undertaking in American studies that is in Austria. He's done a series of books based on these oral histories where he goes back and he finds the great nuggets. If you've ever looked at the oral history, Sandy Berger's is the one that I've read start to finish, as well as Bill Barr's, which we just posted this week, the new nominee for Attorney General. Sandy Berger's is 60,000 words. It's essentially about a 250-page book. The interviewee gets to edit their transcript, so Sandy's reads the way a Sandy memo would, and the reason I read it was I worked for Sandy. To actually produce one of these is not just the 3 days that Russell and his team spent with Sandy. It's the months of preparation in a briefing book. I see Brian Craig here, who is the principal researcher that puts those books together. We mail them out. The person reads them in advance. We read them in advance. We conduct the interview, and then you have to transcribe and edit the transcript. This is an enormously painstaking undertaking, and Russell is the master in doing that. And then he pulls out the nuggets and binds them together in various books that help tell the story. So he's done one of those on Clinton. He's also written on the Clinton oral history. He's also written on bridging the constitutional divide and on the presidency and the politics of racial inequality. He's written for the Washington Post, Politico, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal. And so, Russell, thank you for doing the interview today. Before we turn it over to them, I want to introduce one last person, which is Jim Murray, who is the vice rector of the university's Board of Visitors. But more importantly, today he's the founder of the Presidential Precinct, which is an important partner of the Miller Center. We host a number of different events and activities. They host a signature leadership training seminar every summer, and they use the homes of Monticello, Montpelier, and Highland, the presidential homes in our midst, and learning centers, along with UVA and William and Mary, to train young emerging leaders. Jim is the founder of the Presidential Precinct, and as well as the managing general partner at Court Square Ventures. And we're just delighted to have you with us today, Jim, to give us a few words of welcome, and then we'll turn it over to our guests.
Good morning. As Bill alluded to, we've had several years or more of casual collaboration and friendly working relations with the Miller Center and the Presidential Precinct. The synergy between our two organizations is simple and powerful. In the simplest terms, we're both all about democracy. If I continue in simplified terms, I'd contrast the two organizations in this way. The Miller Center is experts working with experts to draw historical lessons from the past. The precinct is experts working with amateurs to use those historical precepts to, on the ground, build the future. So the precinct's a collaboration, as Bill suggested, between two of America's great public universities, William & Mary and UVA, and 4 presidential sites. Jefferson's, Monticello is an affiliate, and then we have partnerships with Madison's Montpelier, James Monroe's Highland, and Morven, UVA's Morven, where William Short, America's first diplomat, resided. The mission of the precinct is to bring the power of these places. We are here in Central Virginia. We are the epicenter of the creation of America. If you think about where the great ideas came from, where did the Declaration come from, where did the Constitution come from? It came from here. And so we take these places and go to search for emerging leaders, proven leaders, ages 25 to 35, anywhere in the world, everywhere in the world, who are trying to overcome the difficulties of building democracies in their country. And we bring them here physically for programs, and we assemble them virtually in a web presence which now numbers almost 10,000 people, where they can collaborate with each other and work on these lessons of democracy in the interest of growing their countries, trying to build what was built here 200, 300 years ago. So it's in that context we're here this morning with the Miller Center in a formal way, which is a great pleasure. We are here hosting one of the living legends who hopefully will give us more insight into recent history and more lessons that we can draw from that. And if and when he does, we hope the precinct can use those lessons, take them to the farthest corners of Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, with young people, and say, this is how it should be done. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Jim. And one last piece of product placement. The Presidential Precinct is a real partner with us in building the Presidential Ideas Festival. And I think you've seen some of the announcements and collateral about that, which will be May 21 to 23 in 2019. So with that, I'm going to hand the proceedings over to Stu, and he's going to give us a little bit of an overview, and he and Russell will go at it.
Thank you very much, Bill and Jim and Professor Riley. I want to start by saying I promise not to talk about ACC basketball. It's really a special pleasure to be here. It really is, for a couple of reasons. First, I cite the Miller Center's own survey of President Carter's success record with Congress, which I'll mention in a minute. Second, I relied significantly on the interviews that were done here, including my own. So in that sense, I feel very much at home. In addition, it's such a treat to be reunited with Bill. He was very kind to talk about my Kyoto climate change negotiations, but the first essential ingredient of a successful negotiator is to have people on your team who are smarter than you are. And that is Bill Antholis. I will tell you one cute anecdote that sort of relates to the Carter years. One of the weapon systems that we ended up stopping was called the neutron bomb, and its great attribute was that it killed people, namely the people driving Soviet tanks, and it left the buildings intact. That was so here we are at the last day of Kyoto, 13 days, nobody has any sleep, and we're in the plenary, and my whole team, we had like 50 people, are just planked on the walls, sleeping on the floors, totally asleep. And I said, now I understand what the neutron bomb is all about. All the people are dead, but the building is intact. I also want to tell you how, just from a personal standpoint, a very close relationship with some of the founding members of this center, Ken Thompson, Jim Young, and your own Professor Sabato has given a great endorsement for my book as well. Jimmy Carter's political idol was Harry Truman, and he placed his famous slogan, "The buck stops here," on his Oval Office desk. Both presidents left office highly unpopular. Truman is now remembered much more for his achievements than for his failures. And I hope my book will have a similar impact on reassessing Jimmy Carter as president, not simply as an admired former president. Indeed, independent surveys, including the Miller Center's, indicate that almost 70% of all our legislation was passed by the Congress, just under the percent of the legendary master of Congress, Lyndon Johnson, who, by the way, Bill, was my first boss. That was the first White House I worked in. He honored the office of the presidency. He honored the independence of the Justice Department, the FBI. He respected the role of the press in a democracy, even when it was brutal to him. Walter Mondale, his vice president, put it very succinctly: we told the truth, we obeyed the law, and we kept the peace. Now, the wrap on the Carter presidency is summarized in my book by 4 I's: inflation, Iran, inexperience by the president and his Georgia mafia, and inter-party warfare within the Democratic Party with the liberal wing of the party headed by Ted Kennedy, who ran against him and split the party. And I do not gloss over or whitewash these problems. One of the reasons that thankfully the New York Times and Washington Post and even conservative publications like the National Review have given the book such good reviews is I don't whitewash these problems. I deal with them straight on, but they have obscured the very real and lasting achievements, both at home and abroad, that I saw at the president's right hand. And so I wanted to write a book that would be a total assessment of the presidency while there were still living eyewitnesses, including, thankfully, the president himself, and before history's verdict that this was somehow a failed presidency was indelibly sealed in people's minds. So what you will see in this book and what I present to you now is an unvarnished story of the administration, mistakes and failures, yes, including my own. This is not a book that could be entitled If He'd Only Listened to Me, but also the successes and achievements. And it's based on uniquely, and I think it distinctively from any other presidential history I'm aware of, 5,000 pages plus of my own contemporaneous notes, a habit that I took from UNC and Harvard Law School into the White House, writing down what, so you better be careful of the questions you ask me. Whatever people said, whatever I heard, whatever I observed, I put contemporaneously on these now some 5,000 pages of notes, and I augmented them with over 350 interviews, some from here, but mostly my own. And I wasn't selective. I interviewed Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, detractors and supporters, so I could present a complete and full package on the 39th President of the United States. To understand our presidency, you have to understand the decade of the 1970s in which we governed. And looking at the audience, most of you probably weren't born in the 1970s, so I'll remind you that this was a period of epic change. The post-World War II consensus had begun to unravel with our first loss of a foreign war abroad in Vietnam, with urban violence racking our major cities. I remember being on the portico of the LBJ White House and seeing 14th Street burn just a few blocks away. And with a new economic phenomenon that economists had to give the ugly name stagflation. It hasn't happened before or since. Simultaneous low growth and high inflation, that engulfed all 3 presidents of the decade, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. It was a decade in which a whole range of new movements began, which we take for granted now, but which burst onto the scene then. The environmental movement, the consumer movement, the Black Power movement, now morphed into Black Lives Matter, the women's rights movement, now Me Too, hashtag Me Too, and after the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision on abortion, which, by the way, we haven't seen the last of, the pro-life movement. It was also a decade in which a new political force, which is extremely viral and important today, was created by Reverend Jerry Falwell from one of your neighboring communities here. It was the catalyzation of the Christian evangelical movement into a political force. Falwell said that Carter, who was undoubtedly the most religious president that we've had in American history, wasn't a real Baptist. You wouldn't know it from the Sunday school lesson I went down to see him do a couple of weeks ago, and harbored homosexuals on his White House staff. We're talking about the 1970s, mind you. which was false. What Ronald Reagan successfully did is he married that new catalyzed Christian evangelical movement with Richard Nixon's so-called silent majority of disaffected blue-collar workers in the industrial Midwest to form a winning coalition in 1980, and that's precisely the base of Donald J. Trump's presidential coalition today. The 1970s was also critically important abroad. The Soviet Union was at the apex of its power and influence, enormous increases in defense spending on land and sea and in the air, threatening our own hegemony and power in those fields, acting aggressively, as we'll see shortly, by invading Afghanistan, supporting Cuban proxy troops to stir up communist revolutions in the Horn of Africa, places like Namibia and Angola, supporting Euro-communist parties in Western Europe with some success, particularly in Italy. It was a decade in which a new major power just began to inch its way onto the global agenda and now has done so with both feet planted, the People's Republic of China. Again, more on that shortly. It was a decade in which a Polish-born priest became Pope John Paul II and gave hope, as did President Carter with him with his human rights program, to people living behind the Iron Curtain. And it was a decade in which a new revolution in Iran, the Islamic radical revolution, engulfed us and remains front page news in 2018. Now let me take you first to some of the domestic achievements which have been long forgotten. The first, and in some respects I think most important, was that the energy security you and I enjoy as Americans today rests significantly on the foundation of the 3 comprehensive energy bills we passed in 4 years. We were at a stage where over 50% of all of the crude oil we were using was coming from OPEC. That's not the case today because our 3 energy bills did the following. We ended price controls on the production of natural gas and crude oil to stimulate domestic production. We put conservation at the center of our energy policy, enacted, for example, the first fuel economy standards for cars and trucks, insulation requirements and the like, and then started the new era of clean alternative energy. Wind power, solar. I was on the White House roof, and there's a photo in the book about this, as he installed symbolically a solar panel on the White House roof. And now 10% of all of our electricity in the United States comes from clean burning solar power. And we solved the most basic, difficult nut to crack in energy, which was natural gas controls that had been on since the 1940s, appropriately in the war room of the White House, where FDR charted the course of World War II with maps, which is why it's called the map room. And in doing so, he did something you'd never see in 2018. He got 2 conservative Republican senators and 2 liberal members of the House, Democrats, to agree on a formula for ending price controls, the kind of bipartisanship so sadly lacking today. Carter was also a great consumer champion. He appointed consumer advocates, some from Ralph Nader's organizations, to regulate industry, not as today, taking people from or lobbyists for those industries, to regulate the industries that were their bread and butter, and then augmented that with transformative deregulation legislation that freed up and transformed our whole transportation system. We ended regulations on buses, on trucks, on trains, and most important for you and I, on airlines. You wouldn't have today the vibrancy of the Southwests and the JetBlues and the UPS and FedEx air cargos if we were living in the regulated environment we were before, which prevented new carriers from coming in, which prevented price competition. We democratized air travel. We brought it to the middle class. Now, I got bumped from a plane and was on the middle seat of an economy class, and so sometimes I wonder about that democratization. But the fact is, we did make it affordable. We have brought it to the middle class with the help of someone I'll mention later, Senator Kennedy, and then a young man named Stephen Breyer. Carter was also a great, and I think the greatest, environmental president since Theodore Roosevelt. We took on costly water projects and stopped them in their tracks. We doubled the size of the entire national park system that Teddy Roosevelt created in the early part of the 20th century through the Alaska Lands Bill over the fierce opposition of the entire Alaska delegation, which wanted the whole state available for oil and gas exploration, and in typical Carter detailed form, got a giant map of Alaska, put it on the Oval Office rug, got on his hands and knees with Senator Ted Stevens, the senior Republican senator, showed him where every mountain range and stream would be, what would be in the park, what would be available for development. And Stevens told us afterward that he had represented the state for 25 years. Carter knew the state better than he did. We won the election in 1976 against President Ford significantly, although not exclusively, as a reaction to Watergate. Carter promised a government as good as its people. I'll never lie to you. And that was not just campaign rhetoric. All the major ethics legislation today was passed in the Carter administration. I'm going to do a program at the museum tomorrow with Ken Starr on the special counsel. We started the special counsel legislation. That's where the Mueller investigation comes from. Not just that, but the Ethics Act of 1978, which is very much enforced today, for the first time required senior officials to disclose their assets and potential conflicts of interest coming into office. It created gift limits, then of $25 when you were in office, and it restricted your ability to lobby the agencies from which you came after office. We created also inspectors general to go in and root out fraud, waste, and abuse, merit selection of district court judges, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to prevent U.S. companies from winning foreign contracts through bribes, and much more, civil service reforms. Now, I got caught up unwittingly in the gift rule shortly after we signed the legislation, because a business magazine did a profile of me and said that I had a great love of the little 1-cent Tootsie Rolls that you may remember when we grew up. You can still get them. And so the Tootsie Roll company sent me this giant box of Tootsie Rolls. I mean, like 3 lifetime supplies. And I had young kids then. I was going to be father for life, taking it home, only to find out from the ethics officer, he said, damned if I'm going to count every one of these things, but I think there may be more than $25 worth. You got to send it back. So I wrote the CEO of Tootsie Roll a very nice letter, thank you, but we're living in a higher moral plane now. About a year later, there's a profile done of the Tootsie Roll company, and the CEO says, Eizenstat tried to have it both ways. He sends us this high and mighty letter. We open the box, it's empty. So I'm still trying to find the Secret Service agent who stole my Tootsie Rolls. More important and more seriously and more relevant today is that, ironically, the first target of the new special counsel law was none other than the President's own Chief of Staff, Hamilton Jordan, whose interview is here. And he was falsely accused by a lawyer by the name of Roy Cohn, who was the hatchet man for Senator Joe McCarthy, and also was Donald J. Trump's first political mentor. And he represented, Cohn, the owners of Studio 54, who were under federal investigation for tax evasion and selling cocaine and so forth, and they thought they could plea bargain by making this false charge against Ham. Well, a year later, $1 million out of his pocket, 24-0, the grand jury says no, but that's not the point. The point is, not once during that investigation, which went into an election year, 1980, did Carter ever say it's a witch hunt, it's politically motivated, we believed in the rule of law and we let it take its course. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Here is a president from the deepest part of the Deep South. You have to go to Plains to believe it. I mean, I was there again a couple of weeks ago. It's not Charlottesville, I can assure you. And yet, this deep South president appoints more women and more African Americans to senior positions in the administration and to judgeships than all 38 presidents before him put together. Ruth Bader Ginsburg in her RBG documentary, but also in my book, says I would never be on the Supreme Court had Carter not opened judgeships to women and appointed me to the Court of Appeals. And we supported affirmative action and minority set-asides. We saved New York City from bankruptcy and created a Department of Education. And I have to say, being now in a citadel of great public education, we doubled and tripled the size of the Pell Grants for low-income students in college and for elementary and secondary education, kids under Title I, and much more. And he and the Vice President, Mondale, created what we now take for granted as the modern vice presidency, which was a constitutional afterthought by our founding fathers. FDR's first vice president, John Nance Garner, said, "It's a position not worth a bucket of warm spit," and I'm cleaning his language up for this audience. It was absolutely a non-eventful position until Mondale and Carter decided otherwise. So during the 1976 transition, after we won the election from President Ford, Mondale sent him a request with 10 items: access to all classified documents, the ability to go into any meeting without prior notice, one-on-one meetings in the Oval Office every week over lunch with the president. Carter not only checked every one of those, he did every one of them, and did something that Mondale didn't even have the temerity to ask for. We moved the entire office of the vice presidency from the executive office across the alleyway to the West Wing, into the West Wing, just down for the Oval Office. And just like in real estate, where location is everything, it is in politics too. And that's where it is today, and it's a symbol that the vice president now is, in fact, a genuine partner. Now, our Achilles heel, it's one of those I's that I mentioned at the beginning, domestically, was inflation. I make no bones about it. We inherited high inflation from Ford and Nixon, and it got worse despite everything we tried. And so here we are, July of 1979. We're thinking about a re-election year in 1980. The president calls us in, and he said, "I have tried everything to deal with this decade-long endemic inflation. I've given 5 anti-inflation speeches, 2 anti-inflation czars. I've cut domestic spending to satisfy financial markets and alienated the liberal wing in the process. I've had voluntary wage and price guidelines with procurement sanctions for companies wanting to do business with the government that have to follow them. Nothing has worked." And so he said, "I've got a choice. I'm going to take the toughest medicine the economy can take, even if it means my re-election," which it did. "I'm going to appoint Paul Volcker to head the Federal Reserve Board," knowing in advance, as I describe in a colorful meeting in my book, exactly what Volcker was going to do. He said to the president, "What I'm going to do is a new monetary policy. I'm going to tighten the supply of money. It's going to cause interest rates to jump sky high, and that's going to cause higher unemployment in your re-election year. If you're not prepared to back me, don't appoint me." He was that blunt. And Carter said, "I don't want my legacy to this country to be high inflation. Even if it means my re-election, I'm going to appoint him." And he did, over the objection of many of us, and it worked. The reason why we have low inflation today, December 2018, is because of the credibility of Paul Volcker and his successors in tightening anytime inflation pressures rest. So it worked. Inflation dropped like a rock in Reagan's first year. Not in time to help us for our re-election. And it's emblematic of so much of what we did, which was we planted seeds that blossomed only after we left office. So in many ways, it was our Achilles heel, and yet his most courageous domestic stand. So let's move to foreign policy. I assert, and I haven't heard anybody argue to the contrary, that Camp David and the Egypt-Israel peace treaty which followed was the single greatest act of personal presidential diplomacy in American history, more than Woodrow Wilson and the Paris Peace Agreement after World War I. So let me set the stage. The president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, makes a surprise trip after 5 wars from 1948 to his trip during the first year of the Carter administration in '77. And he comes with his gleaming Boeing white 707 with Arab Republic of Egypt on the side and lands just after the Sabbath, after Shabbat, in Jerusalem. A red carpet is there, and toughened Israelis, and they're tough. I go there 2-3 times a year. They've been through a lot, are crying like babies. Golda Meir, as former prime minister, next to Yitzhak Rabin, says, I wish he had come a few years earlier and saved all the lives we lost in the Yom Kippur War. And as Begin comes to Golda, she said, I've been waiting for you for a long time, Mr. President. And he said, yes, and I'm here in peace. Shalom, no more wars. And that's what he said in the Knesset, no more wars. But months go by to try to convert this phrase, no more wars, into something tangible and something binding. And the Israelis and Egyptians utterly failed. And so, against the advice of his advisors, Carter swings for the fences, and he invites Menachem Begin, then the Prime Minister of Israel, and Sadat to the presidential retreat at Camp David in the Catoctin Mountains, bars the press, and sees if he can bridge these seemingly unbridgeable divides. 13 agonizing days and nights with almost no sleep. He drafts 22 separate peace agreements and has to negotiate them separately with Begin and his team and Sadat and his team, because we put them together the first day and it was 2 scorpions in a bottle. It was absolutely impossible. And he adds 2 personal touches. Having studied these people, this was not a photo opportunity summit. He studied the CIA records. What makes these guys tick? What's their red line? What can move them? What can they not go beyond? So his first personal touch is on the first Sunday of the 13 days. He takes them in his presidential limo, Begin on his left, Sadat on his right, to nearby Gettysburg Battlefield. And by the way, ironically, I gave a speech at Gettysburg College on the book a couple of weeks ago and found the actual guide who took them around. And it was an electric meeting. Sadat was a general. He had studied in the United States. He knew the Gettysburg Battle. He knew all the mistakes the Confederates made. Pickett's last charge, and starts expounding on them, which was a little uncomfortable for Carter as a president. Begin was anything but a general, but he was a Lincoln scholar, and literally on the spot, verbatim, he gives Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It's really a very moving moment. Having said that, we're now at the last of the 13 days, the last Sunday, where everybody agreed if we can't do it now, we can't do it. And Begin says to Carter, Mr. President, I'm not bluffing, I'm out of here. I cannot and will not make any more compromises. I've got an El Al plane waiting at Andrews Air Force Base, get me a White House limousine so I can go. I tried, we didn't succeed. And Carter realizes that if he leaves after all of this, Sadat's initiative will go up in flames. He may be assassinated when he comes back empty-handed. It will catalyze the radicals in the region, including Bashar al-Assad's father, then the head of Syria, Hafez al-Assad, and engulf his own presidency. And so he goes to another last-minute personal touch. Again, having studied these guys, he knew that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren. And there was a photo taken when they all first came to Camp David, Carter, Begin, and Sadat. He gets 8 copies made, and he personally autographs the names of each of Begin's 8 grandchildren, best wishes for peace, and he hand delivers it to Begin's cabin at Camp David and sees Begin go through and vocalize the names of each of these 8 grandchildren. He sees his lips quiver and Begin's eyes begin to tear. Begin puts his bags down and said, "Mr. President, I'll make one last try," and the rest is history. 40 years later, never a violation. Now, people think Camp David was the end of it. It's not. Camp David was a framework. It was like Kyoto. It was not legally binding. And it called for a legally binding treaty based on this framework in 3 months. 6 months go by, no treaty. Same thing we had going into Camp David. Carter, again, and I assure you I'm not exaggerating, over every single advisor's objection, he decides to go to the region and make one last try. 4 days later, we're close again, no agreement. Air Force One is refueling. The airspace is cleared. All the aides are on their way from Jerusalem to Ben Gurion. Begin calls up and says, "I'd like to see you, Mr. President, once before you leave. We think it's just a courtesy visit." And the President and Rosalyn are changing to get ready to go back to Washington. And he calls down as Begin comes to the lobby of the King David Hotel and says to us, "Try to entertain the Prime Minister until Rosalyn and I are ready." So while we're there, Begin says to us, "You know, young men, this is a very famous hotel, the King David in Jerusalem." "Oh yes, we know that." He said, "Not for the reasons you think. When I was head of the Irgun Underground, I blew it up when the British were here, but don't worry, I'm not going to do it while Carter is here." And he goes up to the presidential suite. That's where the final agreement was reached. They come down on the elevator to the famous King David Hotel to announce it. It breaks. 2 Secret Service agents have to pull Begin and Carter butt first down there, and I call it the breech birth of the treaty. Carter also put human rights at the center of his foreign policy, not naively, because we were in a contest for the hearts and minds of the world with the Soviet Union. And he applied it very controversially to the right-wing but pro-American anti-communist military dictators throughout Latin and Central America. We got thousands of political prisoners released as a result. We started really the democratic movement in Latin America and created a new era in U.S.-Latin American relations, which remains to this day, by taking that initiative and marrying it to the toughest fight we had in 4 years with the Senate, the Panama Canal Treaty. 80% of the public, when we started, were against returning our canal to the Panamanians, even though it wasn't our canal. And Carter calls and talks to every one of the 100 senators, 2 unlikely heroes. The first, again, something you'd never see today, is a senator of very small physical stature, but a giant of a man, Senator Howard Baker, then the Republican leader, who, knowing that it would foreclose his chance to ever get the Republican nomination, supports the Canal Treaty and pulls a number of Republicans along with him. Again, it's unimaginable in today's environment. And perhaps the most unlikely vote was Senator Hayakawa, a conservative Republican from California, who coined the famous phrase, "It's our canal, we stole it fair and square." An unlikely supporter for the Canal Treaty. So Mondale knows him from his Senate days. He puts Hayakawa on with Carter in the Oval Office. Carter says to him, "What can I do to convince you to support the treaty? Don't talk to me about the treaty. You know what I think about it. But if you'll let me see you once every 2 weeks, just the 2 of us, to share my wisdom in the Oval Office with you, then I'll consider it." And Carter says, "Only once every 2 weeks? I wouldn't want to limit you to that, Senator." Flattered he voted for the treaty. Carter never saw him again. We also applied human rights soft power, if I may call it, to the Soviet Union. We reached out to the democratic movement headed by Andrei Sakharov, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and to then Ayatollah, now Natan Sharansky, the head of the Soviet Jewish so-called Refusnik movement. doubled Soviet Jewish immigration, and Sharansky, in his own book, you don't have to take my word for it, said Jimmy Carter saved my life by saying in the midst of my trial on the fake charge that I was a U.S. spy, that it was hogwash, totally false. And again, he says that saved my life. Now, we didn't only apply soft power to the Soviet Union, and here's one surprise in the book, there are many, because Carter is viewed as somehow being soft on defense. And what I demonstrate, supported by a new Pentagon study, is quite the contrary. We reversed the post-Vietnam decline in defense spending, and all of the weapon systems which Ronald Reagan employed, and I give him full credit for his defense buildup and for helping bring the Soviet Union to its knees. Every one of those weapon systems we started. The mobile MX missile, intermediate nuclear forces in Europe, the cruise missile. You can go to the Hazy Air and Space Center and see the stealth bomber. All of those were green lighted, and even his most conservative critics say that Carter's finest hour was Afghanistan. So there's never, Bill knows this, there's never an off day, off hour in the White House. Christmas 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan and put a puppet as the head of the government. By the way, now our longest war. And Carter reacts with the so-called Carter Doctrine. Any further penetration will be military force. We arm the opposition, the Mujahideen, which Reagan continued. We impose, in an election year, draft registration. We embargo grain to the Soviet Union only weeks before the Iowa caucuses against Kennedy, where they happened to make a lot of it. And in what was one of the most difficult emotional meetings, we decide we're going to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics, which we didn't do when Adolf Hitler in '36 was there and banned Jews and didn't give Jesse Owens his awards and so forth. And telling these Olympiads, these young kids who had spent 4 years training, that they couldn't go was really tough. We created the Freedom Games in Philadelphia. It wasn't the same. So Reagan deserves full credit. We deserve our measure as well. China. Nixon and Kissinger get, again, full credit for reaching out to the People's Republic, the Shanghai Communique, One China, and so forth, but they didn't establish diplomatic relations with China because the Taiwan lobby was such a political force within the Republican Party. We did. We severed relations with Taiwan and created a new cultural and defense relationship through the Taiwan Relations Act, which was another incredibly bloody battle. And we recognized the People's Republic of China diplomatically. So I'm in the cabinet room. Deng Xiaoping comes, all 4'11" of them, into the cabinet room. He thanks the president for establishing diplomatic relations, and then what may seem familiar today, he says, what I really want now is I want the lowest tariff levels that you can give on Chinese products so we can sell you more goods. And he said, I know that there's a law, Jackson-Vanik, which prohibits those low tariffs for countries that bar immigration, but we don't. That's aimed at the Soviet Union. And he takes a little White House notepad, White House, Washington, with a pencil, pushes it over to Carter in the cabinet room, and he says, write on this notepad the number of Chinese you'd like us to send you each year. 1 million? 10 million? So Carter laughs and says, I'll tell you what, we'll make a deal right here. I'll take 10 million Chinese a year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists. Neither had to fill that for. Now, the second I, and the one that was the coup de grace for the Carter presidency, was Iran. And I'm unforgiving in my discussions about Iran in these chapters. Having said that, I don't think it's fair to blame Carter for the Iranian Revolution, for the Shah having to leave, any more than it would be fair to blame Dwight Eisenhower for the Cuban Revolution 90 miles from Florida in 1959, or to blame Barack Obama for Mubarak in the so-called Arab Spring having to be deposed. But having said that, this was, and I say it in the book and I say it to you, the single worst intelligence failure in American history. Here is the Shah, our principal ally, who the CIA installed along with British intelligence in 1953, deposing an elected prime minister. Presidents ever since, from 53 through Carter, Republicans and Democrats, give him an open shopping list of every major weapon system we have. He was our guy. And yet, the CIA did not recognize that his domestic support rested on quicksand. He had alienated all segments of society. Remarkably, they didn't realize that for 5 years, our principal ally was getting secret treatments for incurable cancer. They didn't appreciate the impact that the leader of the Iranian Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, in exile outside of Paris, sending cassettes back to Iran, was having in fomenting a revolution. Absolutely unacceptable. It's very difficult for presidents to make judgments when they get such miserable intelligence. And in one of the 350 interviews, his CIA director, who was his classmate at the Naval Academy, said, "We let the president down," and they certainly did. Now, having said that, Carter makes another mistake. This is one case I wish he had followed my advice. The hostages are taken. How to get them out? So I recommended, and our national security advisor recommended, Brzezinski, immediate military action, not bombing Tehran, but blockading the harbors off Karg Island and other places where all of their oil went, to choke their economy. Instead, Carter meets with the hostage families, says his #1 goal is to get their loved ones back safe and sound, which he does, but only after 444 humiliating days in which our political support evaporates. All this did, including one other thing he did, which was he decided to hold himself up in the White House to show the American people he was working full-time on getting the hostages out. He cancels foreign trips. He cancels campaigning against Kennedy. It backfired. It made him the hostage in the White House. It caused more press attention. Ted Koppel's Nightline program came from this. Some of you may not be young enough to remember this or old enough to remember it, but Walter Cronkite, the dean of reporting, ended every 30-minute CBS segment. Day 103, day 205, day 307 of the hostage crisis. Absolutely debilitating. And then the straw that broke the camel's back, and again it's used to argue Carter was weak, was the failed hostage rescue effort. In fact, it was a courageous effort. Why do they think he was weak? They said he didn't order enough helicopters. The Joint Chiefs wanted 6 helicopters. He added 2 more as backups. 8 was the maximum you could get under the aircraft carrier to get close to the Desert One location and avoid Soviet reconnaissance. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, sandstorms and so forth. But the real problem was you had 4 military services trying to coordinate an extremely complex, very complex rescue. And they never practiced together. There was no joint command. We created one afterward. And so when the rotor blade of one of those helicopters struck the C-130 cargo plane full of fuel so that the helicopters could go into Tehran, it burst into flames. It engulfs 8 brave servicemen who died, and in a metaphoric way engulfed our presidency as well. Now, my book is not just about policy, it's about people. I'll mention just a few because time is short, but I can assure you that the people who come out of this book could come out of a Shakespearean play. The humorous and the villainous, the uplifting and the tragic. Let me mention just a couple. So December 1980, we've just overwhelmingly lost the election. 6 states in the District of Columbia. We lost about 10 million popular votes. No problem with hanging chads, I can assure you. And yet Carter says to us, get your chins off the floor. We've got 2.5 months to go. We're going to make this the most productive post-presidency ever. We get the Superfund chemical waste bill done. We get the Alaska Lands bill done. We reach the agreement on the hostages. And then one personal item that I'm going to mention now. So Ted Kennedy calls me up, December 1980, And he said, Stu, there's a vacancy on the First Circuit Court of Appeals. I'd like the president to appoint someone you know, a Harvard Law School professor who took a leave of absence, worked with you and me to get airline deregulation done, Stephen Breyer. He'd be a great tribute to the president. I said, Senator, there are two insurmountable hurdles to this. What are those? I said, well, the first is there's no love lost between Carter and you. He thinks you helped lose the presidency for him because you not only ran against him, but didn't reconcile. He said, I know, that's why I'm calling you instead of the president. He said, what is the other problem? I said, well, the other problem is we lost the Senate. Strom Thurmond's going to be the new head of the Judiciary Committee. You don't have to wait 8.5 months like happened in this past situation. Why, I said, Ted, wouldn't Thurmond just wait 2.5 months and then Reagan will appoint a conservative Republican? You take care of Carter, I'll take care of Strom. So I go in to see Carter with some trepidation. I said, forget who's asking for this, but you know Steve Breyer, you know how important he was to airline deregulation, you know how brilliant he is. He said, I'll do it. He knew what was up. He said, I'll do it. So I called Kennedy back. I said, I've done my end of the job. How about you? Strom is in the bag. I said, what do you mean he's in the bag? You guys are at opposite ends ideologically. He said, well, Strom likes Steve because Steve has breakfast every morning with Strom's chief of staff, Emory Sneeden. They work things out quietly in a bipartisan way. And Steve Breyer is not only nominated by the president, he's unanimously supported by all the Republicans and all the Democrats. A time gone by. Now, two profiles, then Carter, then we close. Profile number one, Miss Lillian. You can't understand Jimmy Carter without understanding his mother, Miss Lillian. In her 20s, as a registered nurse in Plains, Georgia, she does the unthinkable and tends to black and white patients and gets paid in vegetables and chickens. At age 68, she goes into the Peace Corps in India. And she's, of course, a fierce defender of her son as he's running for president with his famous statement, I'll never lie to you. So a reporter comes down from New York and starts cross-examining her in Plains and said, now, come on, Miss Lillian, you're his mother. You know that he must have told lies growing up. Of course he did, says Miss Lillian. Honey, he told all sorts of white lies. Well, what do you mean by a white lie? Well, you know when I said how wonderful it was to have you down here from New York? That was a lie. I also saw a beautiful thing happen with Rosalyn Carter, who was so shy when he ran for governor, and I was his policy director then as well as when he ran for president. She literally could not speak on a podium. She just couldn't. And I saw her blossom like a flower as an effective first lady, only the second next to Eleanor Roosevelt to testify in Congress. She wrote her own mental health legislation and lobbied it through. She became an extraordinarily effective person and an envoy in Latin America on human rights and much more. So the principal player, and with this I'll close, is of course Jimmy Carter. Here is someone who comes from a gnat-infested hamlet of 500 people with no traffic lights, and he makes it all the way to the Oval Office. Through indefatigable campaigning, 100 days alone in Iowa before the caucuses, but also because he has what every winning president has to have, their hand on the pulse of the American public at that moment in time. It may be different than 4 years before, it may be different than 4 years after. Carter understood what people wanted even after 8 Republican years, even Democratic voters, was not a new great society. They wanted honesty and integrity. They wanted to remove the stain of Watergate. And as an outsider, appealing to that ethics and morals, that's what they wanted, and that's what got him elected. He, in many ways, was the first new Democrat, fiscally moderate to conservative, progressive on race and gender issues, a free trader, someone who believed, God forbid, that alliances were actually important. And yes, he was rightly criticized for excessive detail. I used to get memos with misspellings circled. He always wanted more and more information, but I've begun to think over the years maybe it's better to have too much information than none at all to make presidential decisions. he had a very odd view of politics. He was a ferocious campaigner, but believed that when you entered the White House, you parked politics at the Oval Office door. That was his great strength and his great weakness. The great strength because it allowed him to take on Panama and the Middle East and energy, which were political losers. But his great weakness, because a president's not just commander-in-chief, he's got to be politician-in-chief. He's got to nurture his political base, keep his party behind him, which this president does very well, and he didn't. In the end, he was too liberal for conservatives and too conservative for liberals. My book will take you more deeply into the White House. You'll not only understand Jimmy Carter's presidency, you'll understand what it's like to work in the hothouse atmosphere of the White House where there are no good options, continuous pressures on you. I'm not nominating Jimmy Carter for a place on Mount Rushmore. I am suggesting he belongs in the foothills with a number of other presidents who have made significant contributions to their country and to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stu.
Can I just say before as we go into the question period, one person I do profile, Senator Russell Long, who was the senator, chaired the Senate Finance Committee through which much of our domestic legislation went. And he was the son of the famous Huey Long, the Kingfish, the governor of Louisiana, late 20s and early 30s. And he told me the following story, which is appropriate as we now go into this period. So he says, I grew up as a young lad in Baton Rouge in the governor's mansion. Papa comes home stone cold drunk one night with a very shaky hand, finally gets the key in the keyhole to a line. The door opens, Papa collapses in the foyer, and Mama, his mother and the governor's wife, looks down sternly for an explanation as to how this state of affairs could have occurred to the governor of the great state of Louisiana. And Russell said that Papa said without any pause, Mama, I've completed my prepared remarks. I'll now take questions from the floor. So I assure you I've only gotten water, nothing spiked, but I'll be glad to take questions from you.
Let me say just a word or two in advance to give you a chance to catch your breath, and that is that I want to commend to all of you this terrific book. I actually think that it is probably unparalleled in the works on the American presidency, in that it includes the immediacy and intimacy of a president of the United States, the kind of reports that you get from Arthur Schlesinger and Ted Sorensen on President Kennedy, for example, and also a thick form, but it's tempered with the critical distance of history that you don't get from these others, and it really is quite striking. So I won't tell you that it's a quick read. I mean, you can look here, won't insult your intelligence that way, but I will tell you that it is an easy read, and it has a sort of narrative flow of a novel and following not really the timeline, because you have an interesting way of dealing with issues as they come to you on an issue-by-issue basis. But it's greatly enriched by these character sketches that you do, as you've just provided with Senator Long, for example. And so it is absolutely a terrific read, and I commend it to you. We've got some out back, and we'll say more about that in just a minute.
If I may say, just as because I feel such a tie to the Miller Center, I'm subsidizing it, and we'll sell it for $20, and I'm paying the difference between that and what it would always be.
So not only can you get it, get a good book, you can get it at a discounted price thanks to the generosity of the author. But it really is a terrific book. The second thing that I would say is that in 2009, we convened in this room a symposium of domestic policy advisors where we had probably a dozen people who held the same job that Stu had, from the Nixon administration all the way forward to the George W. Bush administration, to talk in a candid setting, to compare notes about what that job is like in each administration. And one of the most impressive things to me during that session was the extent to which there was great respect for this person on my left, even to the point, I think, of deference there. And I understood that partly at the time as a testimony to the craftsmanship of Stuart Eizenstat as a domestic policy advisor. I think there was an enormous amount of respect for how he did that job and how he went about dealing with some very difficult problems in a very difficult environment. I think one of the things that's come to me from listening to you today and also from having read the book to the extent that I've gotten through it thus far, there was also an enormous amount of respect and deference because of what you did. It wasn't just the craftsmanship, but it was the willingness of President Carter and the domestic policy operation to tackle a lot of awfully difficult problems in a politically unforgiving environment in a way that most of these other domestic policy advisors didn't have to deal with. And so I have a renewed appreciation for that level of respect and deference that I saw from your colleagues, because I think it's testimony to the fact that you made their jobs a lot easier by tackling some of the things that you did. Now, watching the clock and recognizing that you can see that I scratched off a lot of my own questions. I think what I'm going to do is democratize the questioning process.
That looks like
here.
Mueller's indictment with all the...
But having had most of my questions answered, I think I'm going to rely on a democratic theory of questioning and sort of go ahead and open it up here. I was going to ask you about, I'll get us started, and then Christina or okay, we've got a microphone that will circulate if you've got your questions. I'll open it up. But one of the interesting aspects of the book that you touched on briefly but didn't go into in great detail was Rosalyn Carter's role. That to me, among the surprises in your account, was the importance of Mrs. Carter to this president. I wonder if you could say just a few more words about what she did for President Carter during his presidency.
Yeah, I mean, they were and are now 72 and a half years into their marriage, a real partner. So she, for example, went to cabinet meetings so she could be informed. When he decided, I think wrongly, not to campaign during the hostage crisis, she took that on. She was his first envoy to Latin America only a few months after the inauguration to deliver the tough message that we were going to cut off arms to the military dictators. I mean, in fact, when the trip was originally planned, the people who were supposed to meet her were the first ladies of the presidents in Latin America. And she said, no, I want to go to the president. I'm delivering a presidential message. She was the first to have her own East Wing office with her own staff. She drafted, it was of some help, but really she drafted with her staff the mental health bill and lobbied it through. So she was a very real partner, and in many ways was a better politician than he. So let me give you one example. I mean, one of his problems, and I think, Bill, you'll appreciate this, a president has to set priorities. Carter wanted to be his own chief of staff for the first 2 years, a horrible mistake. You need someone who says, you can do this, but you can't do this and this. You can only get one done. He wanted to get it all done. So in the first year, we overwhelmed Congress with energy and welfare reform and tax reform and Panama and so forth. And Rosalyn said, Jimmy, don't do Panama. Wait to the second term. It's too electric. It's going to alienate your conservative supporters. And he said, it's got to be done. Suppose there's no second term. So she was a really very good politician. She made one mistake, and she, along with others, and perhaps we can get that in the question period, and that's the Malaise speech and the vice president almost resigning, but I'll leave that to questions. If nobody answers it, I have to conclude it with this because it's one of the most difficult and most interesting parts of the book.
That's absolutely terrific. Very, very, very novelistic.
So,
Okay. Questions from the audience? Oh, come on. I left it open to you and you're going to do this to me? David, I can always count on you. Thanks.
Regarding one of the I's of which you spoke, inflation, it strikes me that perhaps you encountered the estimable Art Oken on many occasions, and my appreciation of Oken's work is that he was the one who understood it best going forward. Now, you know, of course, that he died tragically
Yes,
at an
I
early
do.
age, 1980. I think he was 52 years
Yep.
old. Describe your relationship with him and what a loss that was in some respects. If I
So
read
I'm
it
going to
right.
use that. First of all, Art Oken was a great man and a great economist, but I'm going to use that for a very important point that I actually made a day ago at the Peterson Institute of International Economics when I devoted my whole speech to the economic side. We were in an extraordinarily new environment. We have high inflation and low growth. It's the opposite of the so-called Phillips curve. Why? The LBJ started it with guns and butter, the Great Society in Vietnam. The OPEC oil embargo, which doubles oil prices, low productivity, high commodity prices. Everybody was fumbling around for it. So what does Nixon do? Going into his re-election in '72, he gets Arthur Burns, his Fed chairman, to goose up the economy by lowering interest rates, and then puts artificial wage and price controls to appear to control inflation. Then when they go off, it bursts up again. Ford comes into office and puts wind buttons on, whip inflation now. And we start fumbling around for a whole range of other options. Carter was the first in his administration to understand inflation was as much a problem as unemployment. We're Democrats. We ran against the Ford recession. We start stimulating the economy with tax cuts. So, okay, then we try all these options. Art Oken comes up with a brilliant solution that might appeal to Democrats. It was called real wage insurance. It would require legislation, and the whole concept was that if a worker would accept wage increases below what they otherwise would get, so instead of taking 13% like the steel workers, you take 8%, they would get in tax cuts the difference. It's really a very neat idea. It simply never got off the ground. But in losing Art, we lost something very special and very precious. But it was an indictment of the whole generation of Keynesian economists, what happened in stagflation. Paul McCracken, who was Nixon's economic advisor, when I interviewed him for the book, said, you guys did what everyone told you to do in 1977, 78, which is stimulate the economy. We never thought inflation was going to jump like it did. So it really indicted it, and then then Ronald Reagan comes in and adopts what is a Republican orthodoxy to today. That is, we're going to have supply-side economics. We're going to cut taxes, particularly on the rich, and that's going to get more revenue back in. It doesn't. But Reagan had something going for him, which we didn't until the end. He had the credibility of Paul Volcker. So our highest deficit was $60 billion. Reagan's deficits were in the triple digits. But inflation dropped because of what the Fed did to install discipline. And I would say in tribute to Art, even most Democratic economists weren't willing to bite the bullet on tough monetary policy.
Others? Bill? Oh.
No one else. If there's somebody else, please.
Anybody?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
Bob, please.
Yes.
Bob Strong. Right here, she's coming.
Thank you. If you read commentary about Carter while he was in the White House, lots of people would have said, he's naive, he's weak, he's indecisive. The people who worked for Carter almost uniformly said, that's not just wrong, that's 180 degrees wrong. He is an unusually confident, determined, and even stubborn person. Is it right that the people who worked for Carter thought of him differently than the public and the media? And secondly, if that is correct, why did we get it so wrong?
Okay, so that's a very good question. First of all, it is wrong. If anything, he was too determined, too, self-assured that he saw a problem, he was going to solve the damn thing without taking into account all the politics around it. He had difficulty compromising because of his moral beliefs. So one of the great attributes of a president, a successful president, a president who appears to be, is something that one of my most endearing people in the book, who was our trade representative, Bob Strauss, said, it's making lemonade out of a lemon. So president proposes, the Congress disposes. And presidents who are successful politically can take whatever Congress comes back and say it's a great success. Instead, Carter always seemed to say, I asked for much more, where's the rest of it? So that was part of it. Second, when you can't control inflation, you look weak. It is just unbelievably disabling. When you can't get hostages out of a third-rate country, you look weak. And so these four eyes overwhelmed the positives and created this image. And one of the reasons, again, that I'm trying to write the book is to correct that, even on defense spending. Now, if nobody's going to ask it, I'm going to ask the question myself, because I don't want the session to end without going into what was, I think, one of the most colorful parts of the book, and that is the whole so-called Malaise speech and what happened thereafter. So let me put you back in the picture. Carter's polls are dropping as inflation is going up and growth is going down. He comes back from the G7 summit in Tokyo, and he had planned to stop in Hawaii for a couple of days in R&R with Rosalyn. They had been in Hawaii during his naval days. I write him a memo saying, you can't do that. You've got to come straight home, forget your vacation. I know you're tired. Because if you're pictured with Rosalyn in a bathing suit on Waikiki Beach and people are in gas lines trying to get gasoline, it's going to be devastating. So he comes home, he's grumpy. He cancels the energy speech I worked on to try to deal with the gas lines. He goes to Camp David. He has the best and the brightest come up to try to help him write his presidency, one of whom is a 32-year-old first-term governor who says, Mr. President, one of your problems is you're always preaching sacrifice. Turn the thermometers down. Be happy. Be positive. That was Bill Clinton in his first term. So now they're all gone. We have to give a speech. So he decides to give what was mislabeled as the Malaise speech, he never used the term, called the crisis of confidence speech. And he talks about why there's a crisis of confidence. Mondale and I are apoplectic. We say in the same table at which Camp David is negotiated, this is nonsense. It was Pat Caddell, who was his 29-year-old pollster with this all Malaise stuff and narcissistic side. We said, your polls are down not because the American people think only of themselves. They're down because there are gas lines and there's double-digit inflation. Carter instead buys into this, as does Rosalyn. He gives the speech, and by God, contrary to what I thought, it's an overwhelming success. His polls go up 17% in a day. It touched a real nerve in people. I'm out with him campaigning a couple of days in Detroit and so forth, and it's like the old magic is back. And then he makes a fatal mistake, which Rosalyn was a part of as well, which I was not part of. I didn't know it. He decides he's going to ask his entire cabinet to resign so he can show he's in control, and instead of just firing a couple, it caused chaos. And all the momentum goes. There's an old lady who's in the mailroom of the White House. She's been there since FDR's days, taking the presidential mail, and she says, I've never seen such mail after the speech. Not just postcards, heartfelt letters by the thousands. And then he fires the cabinet, And she says to us, they all stopped. And what happens to Mondale? He's apoplectic. He says, this is amateur hour. And he calls me up. We had a unique relationship for a vice president and a presidential aide where he shared things with me. He said, I want you to meet me at the Blue Moon restaurant opposite the National Cathedral on Wisconsin Avenue, so we'll be just alone over lunch. And the reason why there was no competition for tables, if you have any food at the Blue Moon restaurant, you'll know why. And he says to me, I'm out of here. I'm gone. I'm resigning. I can't take this. And I said, you can't do that. There's no. He actually has his legal counsel, Mike Berman, look at it. In the end, he didn't, but it showed how difficult he felt, how much he was opposed to this whole effort. And that was another part of the presidency, which again I illuminate in the book.
Let me ask one further question. Christina, I'm looking to you to see how we are on time. Okay. I actually have let me get this out and then I'll come back to you. This suggests that there's a fifth I, and that is the imperial presidency. So this notion of sort of a grandiose presidency, excessive presidency associated mostly with Nixon, Carter takes advantage of to get elected. And yet, it's very clear in reading your book that those very same impulses not only benefit him as a candidate, but they make him a victim once he is in the White House. I wonder if you could say a few words about this.
It's very sharp and incisive thought, Russell. So Carter ran as every man. Carries his own suitcase. He stayed with supporters in Iowa instead of hotels, frankly, because we couldn't afford it. And he runs against the imperial presidency. He runs against H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff for Reagan, who kept everybody away. He's going to have cabinet government, an open presidency. And then when he comes into the White House, he tries to carry that with him. He bans playing Hail to the Chief when he comes into the East Wing initially. And I said to myself, having worked for Johnson, I said, it's no fun working here if you can't hear Hail to the Chief. And finally, we say, look, you're president of the United States. People don't want you carrying your own bags, and they want to hear Hail to the Chief. We have our first leadership breakfast, and we had them every week. Carter was not a schmoozer with Congress, but one of the reasons we got your high rating is because he met with the Democratic leadership every week. The first leadership breakfast after we inaugurated, he was a penny pincher. Jody Powell, his press secretary, said he was tight as a tick on spending. And after 8 years, what does he serve? Continental breakfast with coffee and tea, sort of dry toast, and a few muffins. And Tip O'Neill, who's a speaker, who's a giant of a man, says, I've waited 8 years, Mr. President. I expect a real presidential breakfast next time. And after that, it was bagels, you know, and bacon and eggs and so forth. But it was part of this feeling uncomfortable in his skin with taking on the presidency. And it was a problem throughout. How do you keep this everyman connection to the average person and still have all the accoutrements which go? Do you know that he banned our door-to-door limousine service? A one-day headline, a 4-year headache. I lost an hour of reading time having to drive in. He sells the presidential yacht, the Sequoia, called the Honey Fitz, which is the most incredible lobbying thing you can imagine, getting wives and congressmen down the Potomac. And he wanted to sell Camp David, to sell Betty. And Rosalyn says, don't do it, we're going to need that for a weekend. And little did she know we wouldn't have the Camp David, of course, with it. But it's this feeling of sort of being uncomfortable having run against the imperial presidency, and yet you are the imperial president.
One question, please. Wait just a second, but we are broadcasting, so it would be helpful. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Domestic policy advisor, and yet you're involved in international policy, everything else. How is that? Is there a division? Is there
There is a division,
jealousy?
there is a division, but I was an exception. I mean, first of all, I was his policy director for all policy in the presidential campaign. I got the Foreign Policy and Defense Task Force together. I worked with them. Second, I was an official back channel to Israel on the Middle East peace process. In fact, one of the amazing discoveries was I was in Israel for one of my visits, and a lady comes up to me and says, "Are you Stuart Eizenstat?" And I said, "Yes." She says, "I am working with the archives of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. We're declassifying all the Begin-era archives. Would you like to see the cables the Israeli ambassador sent about your meetings with them?"
Wow.
So I worked on a whole range of foreign policy issues. I did the Iranian sanctions issues and so forth. So it was just, we had a very unique trust relationship, and a lot of the issues like sanctions against the Soviet Union for Afghanistan, sanctions against Russia for the hostages, involved domestic issues. I mean, getting the sanctions together. So it overlapped.
Okay, Stu, thank you so much.
We have one last
Can we,
one.
Bob, go ahead, please. Hang on, we're going to get the mic up here.
Is it a yes or no answer?
2 words, Burt Lance. What is he the exception to the profiles you're creating of highly knowledgeable, well-prepared, well-articulated, closely aligned in values kinds of persons, or why was he the exception
I
that he appeared
called
to be?
my Burt Lance chapter the indispensable man. Burt Lance was his highway commissioner when he was in governor. He made the political deals to get legislation done through the Georgia legislature Carter didn't feel comfortable doing. He was his fixer. I mean, Burt was physically and in every other way bigger than life. I mean, he's like 250 pounds and 6'4". During the transition, before he got into office, he had 2 license plates, one on the front that said Burt and one on the back that said Lance. He got caught up in a banking scandal before he came into office, for which he was ultimately cleared by a trial. And the legal counsel, inexperienced for Carter, who was a real estate lawyer when he came up, misread the Comptroller General's report on those because it was not suggesting an indictment. He thought he was clear. He calls Carter up at Camp David. Carter comes down. This is one place where I wish he had read every page. And he says, "Burt, I'm proud of you." And many investigations later, he has to resign. There's a great scene in the private room where they're kneeling together next to the Oval Office and praying. The prayers didn't reach high enough, and Burt has to resign. Burt's wife says to Carter going out, "You've joined all the jackals after my husband Burt and your best friend. How dare you do that?" It was awful. But when we lost Burt, we lost our connection to the Southern governors and Southern base. He was great with Congress. He loved the Georgetown crowd and parties. That's why I call him the indispensable man. And he was an age compatriot of Carter. We were all 20 years younger. Burt could go in and say, "The emperor has no clothes, you can't do it." So it was a huge, huge loss for us. He would have been better off being a White House advisor not subject to Senate confirmation. He didn't know the first thing about running the budget, but he had to be confirmed. So it was an enormous loss. It's a great chapter and a great profile. And no, he doesn't meet the definitions of all the things you've just said, but he was still an enormous help to Carter and an enormous loss when we lost him.
I'll echo that. There's a very rich and nuanced chapter on Lance early in the book that is consistent with what I said earlier about these just terrific character sketches of people in government. The Miller Center succeeds and thrives as an institution because of people like Stu Eizenstat, who come again and again to help us out. He was here in 1982, I discovered, January of 82, spent 2 days with us interviewing on the Jimmy Carter project. That interview was still on the website, so if you want to look at that, you can. He returned, as I said, for the Domestic Policy Advisors Conference. He also, you didn't mention this, you said you might, that on the project we did with Senator Edward Kennedy, was asked by Senator Kennedy, as I understand it.
I was the only Carter aide. This is how close, even after this really brutal and divisive Democratic primary campaign that he ran, we still, Teddy and I had a very, very close relationship. And I'm the only Carter aide he asked to do a transcript for his library, and it was done here as well.
Exactly. So you've contributed that and then made a singular contribution in coming back and talking with us today. So thank you very much, Stu, and I hope you'll all join me in thanking Stu for his time. One second, Christina, I need to get Stu back out there so he can sign some books, I think. So we're going to let you escape first, if you will. They'll take that. They'll take Stu. Okay.